December 7, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. Much has been said around the circumstances and consequences of the attack on Pearl Harbour and how it kicked off the opening of the Pacific theatre of World War II. And while the US bore the overwhelming brunt of action over the course of the Pacific War, they were not the only allied nation in the Pacific threatened by Japan's declaration of war. Okay, you can read the title of the video, I'm talking about Australia. Although for good measure, I'm also lumping in New Zealand with us, since they also bore a good chunk of responsibility in the Pacific. Anyhow, so what are we covering? We are looking at the positions of major vessels of the Royal Australian and Royal New Zealand navies around the time of the attack on Pearl Harbour on December 7, 1941. Now, I specify major vessels because I'll only be talking about destroyers and cruisers operated by the two nations. Otherwise, we'd be here for the next year tracking down every single corvette, minesweeper, or auxiliary vessel operated by the two. And that's a long fucking list. Starting with the two biggest ships between the two navies, the heavy cruisers HMAS Australia and HMAS Canberra. Australia was docked in Sydney at the time, having recently returned from convoy escort and search operations in the Indian Ocean. Following the Japanese declaration of war, she would become the flagship of the Anzac Squadron and subsequently of the Australian fleet. Australia's sister ship, Canberra, was also docked in Sydney, also having recently returned from convoy escort operations. Now into the light cruisers. Funnily enough, of the 6 light cruisers that served with Australia and New Zealand through the early portions of the war, 5 of them were of the Leander class, although one of the Australian ships, HMAS Sydney, was lost in November of 1941, so we won't be including her here. In any case, starting with the Australian ships, HMAS Perth was at Sydney, having recently finished her working up period after a refit, and was preparing to sail for Northern Australia at the time. Perth's surviving sister, Hobart, was in the Mediterranean, docked at Alexandria in Egypt, having returned from convoy escort duties. HMAS Adelaide, a town-class cruiser and the oldest such type still in Australian service, was at sea close to home carrying out convoy escort duties, just about the only combative duties she was still capable of carrying out at that point in time. And now across New Zealand. HMNZS Leander was docked at Auckland and was recovering from a lengthy deployment in the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean. Leander's immediate sister and Battle of the River Plate veteran, HMNZS Achilles, meanwhile was at sea escorting convoys between New Zealand and Fiji. Now the destroyers. HMAS Vampire was escorting the ill-fated Force Z, out hunting for a Japanese invasion convoy that had been reported to be heading for Malaya. On the 10th of December, she would be one of the 3 destroyers picking up survivors from Prince of Wales and Repulse. HMAS Voyager was in Sydney, undergoing refits and repairs following 2.5 years of continuous service in the Med. The last of the RAN's V-Class trio, HMAS Vendetta, was docked at Singapore. Much like her sister Voyager, Vendetta was in critical need of refit and actually had to be towed away from the area as the Japanese bore down on Singapore. Finishing out the old Australian destroyers is HMAS Stuart, who, like Voyager and Vendetta, was in dire need of repairs following their lengthy involvement with the Scrap Iron Flotilla. She was in Melbourne, refitting and repairing. And now for the newer ships in the RAN at that point in time, 4 fleet destroyers of the N class. HMAS Napier was docked in Alexandria at the time, although unlike the previous 3 destroyers, she was not in desperate need of repair. HMAS Nestor, meanwhile, was in the Atlantic, having just joined convoy WS-14 as an escort on their way to South Africa. HMAS Nizam was at sea, part of the convoy's escort screen heading from Alexandria to Malta. And returning with the ships being laid up for repairs, HMAS Norman was at Southampton to rectify some minor defects in her construction discovered after her working up period. And that's all the major warships that were in commission of the Royal Australian and Royal New Zealand navies on December 7, 1941. Although with that said, all of the major surface combatants that would serve with either navy later in the war were either in service or under construction elsewhere at the time. Starting with the New Zealand ship HMS Gambia, a Crown Colony class light cruiser, she was undergoing sea trials off Wallsend at the time. She would be commissioned into the Royal Navy in February 1942 and was transferred to the Royal New Zealand Navy in September 1943. And the Australian ships, the largest of which was the county-class heavy cruiser HMS Shropshire. Shropshire was undergoing refit at Chatham Yard at the time. She would later be transferred to the Royal Australian Navy in April of 1943 to replace HMAS Canberra, which had been lost in August of 1942. HMAS Nepal, the 5th N-class destroyer and at that time known as HMS Norseman, had just recently been launched and was still under construction at the Thornycroft Yard in Southampton. She would not be commissioned into the RAN until May 1942. HMAS Arunta, a Tribal-class destroyer, was under her final stages of construction at Cockatoo Island in Sydney. She would commission in March 1942. Arunta's sister, HMAS Warramunga, was also under construction at Cockatoo Island. She would commission in November 1942. HMAS Quiberon, I think I'm getting that right, a Q-class destroyer, was undergoing the final stages of her construction before launching at a shipyard in Cowes. She would commission into the RAN in July 1942. And finally, one of Quiberon's sister ships, HMAS Quickmatch, was in a similar state as Quiberon and was also at Cowes on December 7th. She would later commission into the RAN in September 1942. And that's a brief overview of the location of the various Australian and New Zealand vessels on the day of the Pearl Harbour attacks. Stay frosty, folks, and I'll catch you on the next one.